Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Welcome to the second session of the University of Washington MSR Learning Day. And this session starts with Daniela Witten from MIT, Departments of Biostatistics and Statistics, who is going to talk about learning the structure of a graphical model.
Thanks so much for the intro. I actually am not from MIT, but I'm going to add that to my CV. So I'm going to talk about learning the structure of a graphical model. And this is actually sort of a summary of a few different recent and ongoing projects in my research group in the last couple of years. And so, as of course many of you know, graphical models have been a lot of interest in the machine learning community for a number of reasons due to applications in a lot of fields. And in particular, I'm interested in applications in biology. But to briefly summarize, in a graphical model, nodes represent random variables, edges represent conditional dependence. And of course, as we know, conditional dependence between three random variables, what this is that x1 and x2 are conditionally independent given x3. And that's equivalent to saying that the density of x1 given x2 and x3 actually doesn't depend on x2. And so we can represent these conditional dependence relationships in a graph. So for instance, in the bottom left here, we have an example of two nodes that are not connected by an edge. And this corresponds to a pair of nodes that are conditionally independent. And on the top right, we have a pair of nodes that are connected by an edge. And that corresponds to two random variables that are conditionally dependent. And so the goal, on the basis of n independent and identically distributed observations, is to learn the structure of the graph. In other words, learn what are the dependence relationships among these p random variables. And so I'm going to just assume that for convenience that my observations have some density f of theta, so they're IID from this distribution f of theta, where theta is encoding some type of conditional dependence relationship. So for instance, the jth and kth features are conditionally independent if and only if the jk element of theta is 0. And so in particular, this has been a topic of a lot of interest in recent years in the high dimensional setting, where the number of variables p is much larger than the number of observations n. And this is motivated, for instance, by problems in biology where p might correspond to tens of thousands of genes whose expression we've measured, or hundreds of millions of DNA loci, and n corresponds to a relatively small number of tissue samples for whom we've obtained these biological measurements. And so in the high dimensional setting, the way that we usually estimate theta is by solving this optimization problem, which we've all seen before. There's some loss function L and some penalty p. And in high dimensions, this penalty is especially important. And so today I'm going to talk not about the penalty p, but rather about this loss function L, and how we can think about ways to make our loss function less restrictive in order to model flexibly data that might not correspond to an existing loss function or to a convenient multivariate distribution. And I just want to briefly mention that my student Kean Ming has a spotlight and a poster on the other half of this puzzle, which is these penalties p of theta and how we can find a penalty function that induces a more realistic structure. So I'm going to talk about the loss part of this loss plus penalty function. And basically, how do we usually come up with these loss functions? Well, typically we have some kind of assumption for our data, like maybe we assume that the observations are IID from a Gaussian, and then we'll take L of theta to be a negative log likelihood for the Gaussian distribution. Or maybe instead of working with a log likelihood, we'll work with a log pseudo likelihood or a conditional likelihood. But typically this is how statisticians do this, is our loss function is based on some distributional assumption about the data. And I'm going to argue that often these types of assumptions that lead to the loss functions that we use aren't really that well motivated scientifically, and so we may need a more flexible approach. And in particular, I'm going to briefly talk about three more flexible approaches that we've taken. And the first one I'm calling joint additive modeling. So how do we usually come up with these loss functions? Well, we say, I'm going to assume that my n IID observations are, let's say, Gaussian. And then our loss function is just going to be the negative Gaussian log likelihood. Or more generally, we can think about the conditional distributions, like the distribution of xj conditional on the other variables. And we're going to assume that it has some particular parametric form. Like if our data is continuous, we might assume that the conditional distribution of xj is Gaussian. Or maybe if our data is binary, we might assume that there's some underlying binomial distribution or something. But we're using those distributional assumptions in order to come up with a loss function. But actually, in a lot of settings, if we actually look at data, these loss functions that we'd be using don't really seem to fit very well. So here's just a little illustrative example with some data from a 2005 paper published in Science. And in this data set, there were a bunch of cells, and for each cell, they measured about 10 or 12 proteins. So the cells are our observations, and there's around 10 or 12 features. And so this is actually a very low-dimensional example because thousands is much greater than 10. But I'm using this example just to illustrate the point. So what I'm showing here are some scatter plots. And on the left, on the x-axis is one protein, and on the y-axis is another protein. And so if multivariate normality were a reasonable assumption for my data, this should be a beautiful scatter plot shaped like an oval. And it's not. That's not data that you could reasonably approximate by a multivariate normal. And you can see that in all 4 of these scatter plots. And in particular, this is what the data looks like after I've already marginally transformed each variable to look normal. And so this is really the best that you can do with this data. This is the most I can possibly make it look normal, and it doesn't look normal. And this isn't just like a statistical concern that I have that isn't really of practical importance. The loss function that you use actually has really big implications. It changes the edges in the graph that you get, even in such a low-dimensional example. And we can only imagine that in high dimensions, when there's even more edges that we have to worry about, the situation's going to be a lot worse. So the question is, can we take a less parametric approach to coming up with a loss function that doesn't apply on something so strict like multivariate normality? And I should add, there's alternatives to multivariate normality, but really the big picture is how many joint distributions do you know? Like if I tell you you have a p-dimensional distribution where p is really huge, now come up with some joint distribution, you're going to have trouble coming up with one that's scientifically motivated or even a flexible class to work with. I mean, there's more flexible alternatives to multivariate normal, but they're kind of not flexible enough for real data. And so we're not the first to think about this, and a number of authors have taken approaches that they've kind of described as semi-parametric. So in particular, instead of thinking about the conditional distribution of xj given the others, some authors have been able to avoid that by just thinking about the conditional mean of xj. And they say, let's suppose that the conditional mean is linear. So we have kind of a linear model here. And there's an error term epsilon j, and we won't think about what's the distribution of epsilon j. So this is sort of semi-parametric, right? Because we aren't making assumptions on the mean, the distribution of anything. And then we can say that if the estimate beta kj is 0, then xj and xk are conditionally independent. And so people have implied that this is a semi-parametric approach, but actually it's not. If we go back to the literature, what we learn is that even though that equation that I'm calling star makes no distributional assumptions, if star holds for every one of p variables, then there's actually only a very small set of distributions that can satisfy equation star for every variable, and basically that's multivariate normality again. So this does not work as a way to get at a more flexible approach to graph estimation. It's just going to give us back multivariate normality. So as an alternative to make things really more flexible, instead of assuming a linear model for the mean, we can assume a more flexible model, and in particular an additive model, where fjk is just assumed to live within some smoothness class. And then if fjk is 0, we can conclude that xj and xk are conditionally independent given the other variables. So we refer to this approach as joint additive modeling, and we get really nice results. From a statistical perspective, we can prove model selection consistency in high dimensions, but maybe more of interest is the fact that empirically we get better results on data sets where some of the edges are known. And we can recover those edges better. So for instance, in the same cell signaling data set, the loss function that you use really does affect the results that you get, not like 1 or 2 edges change, but really the big picture changes. And we're better able to recover the gold standard edges than other approaches. So the next thing I want to briefly touch on is this idea called mixed graphical modeling. And the point is that in a lot of settings, and especially in biology, we're more and more seeing situations where our variables are really heterogeneous. So you have p random variables, but they're not all of the same type. Maybe you're trying to jointly model DNA loci and gene expression measurements, where some of the gene expression is measured on microarrays, and those are typically continuous valued measurements, and others are measured using RNA-seq, which are discrete measurements that we would typically model using a Poisson or a negative binomial, whereas DNA loci are binary. And so we would end up with a graph that looks like this, where there are just 3 different types of nodes, and we want to understand what the edges are. We want to know what's conditionally dependent on what, but it's not going to be satisfactory to fit a model where our loss function is somehow assuming the same distributional form for every node. And so even though there's a lot of work on loss functions for graphical models, most of this past work assumes that all conditional distributions are of the same form. So for instance, if all of our random variables were Poisson, were from RNA sequencing, then we could assume that every conditional distribution is Poisson if all of our nodes are count-valued measurements. But that wouldn't work in the setting here where we have nodes that are clearly of different types. And so basically in our approach, we're proposing a mixed graphical model where each conditional distribution can take a different parametric form within the exponential family. And so we get nice theoretical results, but what I really like about this work is this is actually a case where we get theoretical results not just so that we can put it in a paper, but actually our theoretical results motivate a more accurate estimator. And so for those of you who are familiar with these model selection consistency results in statistics, they, like every paper is kind of required to have one in order to get published in a good journal, and they're not super surprising, and they don't usually give you that much scientific insight. But in this case, our theory actually tells us something about how we should be estimating the edges in the graph. And so in particular, in these mixed graphical models, one characteristic that they have, of course, is that you have these mixed edges, like an edge between a node that you're modeling as Gaussian and a node that you're modeling as Bernoulli. And what our theory tells us is that if you're trying to estimate an edge between a Gaussian and a non-Gaussian random variable, then you should get that edge by regressing the Gaussian node onto the others, instead of by regressing a non-Gaussian node onto the Gaussian node. So every edge connects 2 nodes. And you can regress node 1 onto the others, or regress node 2 onto the others. And our theory tells us when you're deciding how to estimate an edge involving a Gaussian, regress the Gaussian. And then in contrast, if you're trying to estimate an edge between 2 non-Gaussians, we have a formula that tells us which node should you regress on the others in order to recover that edge, so that your probability of successful recovery will be as high as possible. So for instance, in this case, in this toy example, some of these edges between non-Gaussians I'm going to estimate by regressing a Bernoulli onto the others, and some I'll estimate by regressing a Poisson random variable onto the others. So the last thing that I want to talk about is recent work on marginal screening. And so I've been talking about conditional dependence relationships and a graphical model where an edge between a pair of nodes corresponds to conditional dependence. And as a statistician or as a computer scientist, people who study graphical models typically think that conditional dependence is of interest. So we are usually interested in estimating this edge set E, where an edge between node J and node K means that xj and xk are conditionally dependent. And in contrast, there's a much simpler notion too, which is a marginal dependence graph, where an edge in a marginal dependence graph corresponds to a pair of nodes that's not conditionally independent, but rather that's marginally dependent. And so I think that for scientific reasons, we care about this conditional dependence edge set E, and I think a lot of you will agree with me. But what you'll also probably agree with me about is that the marginal edge set, which I'm calling EM, is a lot easier to estimate. So for instance, like let's say you're working with a biologist and they have data from 20,000 genes for which they've measured expression levels on 100 patients. If they're going to estimate the marginal edge set EM, all that they have to do is compute pairwise correlations, because under a simple set of assumption of Gaussianity, the marginal dependence relationships are just given by correlation. Non-zero correlation corresponds to marginal dependence. So if you tell a biologist to estimate the marginal edge set and they can just calculate correlations, then that's really great. That's something that they can easily do with whatever software they use. Whereas if you talk to a biologist about estimating conditional dependence, even if I as a statistician think that that's really the important thing to be estimating, it's harder to do. It requires some type of paper published in the last 15 years, 10 years, that talks about techniques for estimating a graphical model in high dimensions. You certainly can't do it in Excel. You have to use software that is like in R or something that has a specialized estimator for a high dimensional conditional dependence graph. Estimating E is just kind of a little bit harder and also less intuitive for a biologist. And so this is something that I've had a lot of situations where I'll be talking to biology collaborators and they'll be computing correlations, they'll just be thresholding correlations, and they'll be interpreting those results as though they had estimated the conditional dependence graph. And I spend a lot of energy saying, no, you don't want to do that. You want to estimate conditional dependence, not marginal dependence. So then we thought, okay, maybe before we go around telling everyone we know that sort of correlations aren't what they really want and what they should care about are conditional dependence, like partial correlations, maybe we should investigate this a little bit more and see how much does it really matter whether you estimate E or estimate EM. And so basically the question is, in the high dimensional setting, which is the setting that my collaborators in biology care about, is a simple estimator of the marginal dependence graph a reasonable estimate of the conditional dependence graph? So specifically in the setting of Gaussianity, if I just calculate sample correlations and I threshold them in order to get a poor man's approximation to the marginal dependence graph, does that give me a decent estimate of the conditional dependence graph? And the answer actually is yes. Both in theory, under a very simple set of assumptions that I can explain to a collaborator, this very crude estimator of a marginal dependence graph is a decent estimate of the conditional dependence graph, but also in practice. Empirically, it actually works pretty well to be able to just use an estimate of the marginal dependence graph if really the object that you care about is the conditional dependence graph. So in a way, this is a little bit disappointing because as statisticians and machine learning researchers, we always focus on conditional dependence. But the idea is that in a lot of settings, marginal dependence is a fine proxy. And really, the intuition is that it has to be a pretty pathological situation in high dimensions to be in a scenario where marginal dependence is non-zero, but conditional dependence is zero, or vice versa. Of course, I can construct specific counterexamples. But in large scale, in high dimensions, there are only going to be a certain number of those counterexamples. And typically, a counterexample that you construct in such a way, it would be hard to detect no matter what, even if you're using a more sophisticated estimator. So I want to thank the people involved in this, my PhD students, Shizha Chen and Kean Ming Tan, Ray Song, who's a collaborator at NC State, Ali Shajay, who's faculty at UW, and our student who graduated, Ari Vorman. And I'm happy to take questions. So I'll start answering the part of the question I heard, which is there intuition here for why it's better to regress a Gaussian node onto a non-Gaussian node? Mm-hmm. And so just as a simple example, suppose that you have a graph with Gaussian and Bernoulli random variables, and you're trying to estimate an edge between a Gaussian and a Bernoulli. And so you can regress the Gaussian onto all of the others, or you can regress the Bernoulli onto all of the others. Well, like Gaussian is just like a richer amount of information. It's continuous valued, whereas Bernoulli there's only 2 things that it can take, and it's somehow a lot less informative. So somehow you're exploiting more information if you use the Gaussian as much as possible, instead of using the Bernoulli as much as possible.
Okay. And the other question is, I guess you could estimate the edge probabilities in 2 directions, but why can't you, can you combine them using, like, if you have some probability using inverse variance weighting or something like that?
Yeah, so that's a good idea. So the probability, so the question, well, you all heard that because of the microphone. So so can we somehow combine these 2 probabilities? And the way that these selection consistency results work is that I get a probability that regressing a Gaussian onto the other variables is 100% completely correct, and then a probability that regressing a binary onto the others is 100% completely correct. I don't quite get an edge-specific probability, but I certainly could somehow combine these 2 estimates. Like if both the Gaussian regression and the Bernoulli regression have high enough estimated probability, then I could combine them, whereas if one's really high and one's really low, then I might only use the high one. So that's a good point. And what's really nice is this actually does show up in empirical results. This isn't like a cool theoretical thing that has no practical value, but this actually improves the estimators that you get.
I will ask a follow-up question to the previous one. So is there a nice, easy topological ordering to actually do these regressions so that you obtain the maximum information?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the way that we were thinking about this, and I didn't put a ton of details here, but we were taking a neighborhood selection approach where you basically just regress one node onto all the others, regress one node onto all the others, and you do p regressions, and that's how you get your estimator. But I guess in principle, you could do this better. Instead of just having p independent regressions, you could somehow start with one regression of Gaussians onto the others and then do sub-regressions based on what you've learned. I think such an approach could do better empirically. It would be a little hard to analyze statistically, but that could be a good way to go. And it could definitely do better.
So in the Gaussian case, the marginal and the conditional dependence matrix are related to each other exactly via matrix inversion.
Yeah.
And what you said at the end of the talk sounded very interesting. So are you saying, is there a sort of a generalization or of matrix inversion that in the non-Gaussian case relates to the marginal and conditional dependence matrix?
Yeah.
Could you describe a little bit that transformation?
Yeah, so the work that we have so far that's out is in the Gaussian case, and it really does kind of boil down to what you're saying, right? So in the Gaussian case, marginal dependence is through the covariance matrix, and conditional dependence is through the precision matrix. And there's not that many degrees of freedom. Once you give me the covariance matrix, there's really only one way that the inverse covariance matrix can look, and somehow the problem is constrained in that way. And so then once we get out of Gaussianity, it kind of depends on what you're assuming. But I guess the bottom line is the assumptions that you need to make in order for the marginal estimator to be a good estimate of the conditional estimator, those assumptions are really not only plausible but also transparent and something you can explain to a collaborator, which for me is a really appealing property. And furthermore, it's kind of hard to come up with a counterexample that isn't really contrived. I mean, you can fuddle with things by hand to come up with a counterexample, but it starts to feel a little bit implausible. And so that is still ongoing work.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks so much.
Two poster spotlights follow. The first one is from Kean Ming Tan from the Department of Biostatistics.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kean Ming from the Department of Biostatistics at UW. Today, I'm going to present a new penalty function to learn a graphical model with hub nodes. This is joint work with Palma, Mariam Fazer, Kartik, Svore In, and Daniela Witten. Suppose that we have a data matrix X with n samples and p features. The goal is to understand the conditional relationships among the features. One way to do this is to construct a conditional independence graph. In a conditional independence graph, each node corresponds to a feature, and an edge between a pair of nodes indicates that the pair of nodes are conditionally dependent, given all of the other variables. So suppose that we observe NIID observations with some density function f of x theta. The parameter theta encodes conditional dependence relationship among the features. Two variables are conditionally independent if and only if their corresponding entries in theta are exactly equal to 0. To obtain an estimate of theta, many authors have considered minimize the following penalized negative log likelihood. It is well known that the L1 penalty encourages many elements of our estimates theta hat to be exactly equal to 0. However, there is a drawback using the L1 penalty. Under the Bayesian framework, one can interpret the L1 penalty as placing an independent Laplacian prior on each edge. Therefore, it implicitly assumes that each edge is equally likely and independent of all other edges. This corresponds to an Adolph-Renyi graph on your left, in which most nodes have approximately the same number of edges. However, an Adolph-Renyi graph is very unrealistic in many real-world settings, for which we believe that certain nodes are hub nodes. We propose the hub penalty function to learn graphical models with hubs. We assume that the full graph on your top left corner can be decomposed into a summation of two graphs, an Adolph-Renyi graph with green edges, and a graph solely consisting of hub nodes with red edges. In this example, feature number 3 and feature number 7 are the hubs. In other words, we decompose our parameter of interest theta into the summation of three matrices, Z, V, and V transpose. Z is a sparse matrix which corresponds to an Adolph-Renyi graph. The matrix V contains dense columns which correspond to our hub nodes. This motivates the following hub penalty function. We impose an L1 penalty on the matrix Z to learn a graph that resembles the Adolph-Renyi graph. We impose a sparse group lasso penalty on each column of V so that each column of V are either very dense or contain all 0 elements. We claim that our penalty is able to learn graphical models with hubs. For more information, please come to our poster during the evening session. Thank you.
So today I'll be talking about recursive decomposition for non-convex optimization. And so recursive decomposition is actually a combinatorial optimization technique that we've taken and applied to non-convex optimization, which is continuous optimization. And this is joint work with my advisor, Pedro Domingos. So continuous optimization is an important problem in many areas of artificial intelligence, including machine learning, probabilistic inference, vision, robotics. Unfortunately, many of these problems end up being non-convex, which means that there are many local modes that one has to explore. You can't just take a convex optimizer and get to the bottom and do well. And even worse, a lot of the time, especially in like AI, where we have a sum of a lot of smaller functions, you get a kind of combinatorial explosion in the number of modes, and so it scales exponentially with the number of dimensions of your problem. And so you can invert this by decomposing the problem, which is something that has been done many times. But unfortunately, a lot of these decomposition methods are global, and they look at like the full global structure over the entire state space. And this isn't always practical. So consider protein folding here, which is shown at the bottom right. So this is the problem of finding the lowest energy configuration of this chain of amino acids. And so if you look at it, and any specific conformation, any two amino acids most of the time are not near each other and thus are independent of each other. But if you look at the entire state space, there's always a state where any pair of amino acids is interacting. So the dependency graph between any two variables is an entire full clique. And so there's no global independencies in this graph. And so we introduced this idea of a local structure and local decomposition, which is kind of a subspace-based decomposition method. So we look at specific subspaces and achieve decomposition within those subspaces while trying to find the global optimum. And so you can think about this as a version of context-specific independence, but applied to continuous optimization. So if you're familiar with probabilistic inference or something, context-specific independence is a more general form of independence than conditional independence, which has been discussed earlier today. And so given this idea of local structure and local decomposition, the goal of our algorithm is to just choose good subspaces that both result in decomposition to avoid this combinatorial cost of the number of modes, and also to be able to reach the global minimum, which is the desired goal in the first place. So our algorithm essentially dynamically finds and exploits this local structure while moving towards the goal. And it does this using this combinatorial optimization strategy, which is recursive decomposition. So you choose and assign a subset of the variables. Variables are chosen using a graph partitioning heuristic, which gives you this decomposition that you want. You can kind of see like a figure on the right side there. So you choose the blue variables, and then you set them to values, and suddenly these are no longer variables. You're conditioning on them, and if you choose good values, then you're in some small subspace that is relevant, and you can get further decomposition as a result of that. And then we simplify and decompose and recurse. And this has been a very effective strategy in problems like satisfiability, probabilistic inference, weighted model counting. A lot of combinatorial optimization problems have really avoided a lot of NP hardness as a result of using this strategy. And so we think this is an applicable method as well for non-convex optimization. So our algorithm is called ARTIS for recursive decomposition into independent subsets, subspaces. And yeah, so we have some good results. Analytically, this decomposition allows us to get exponential improvements in time complexity versus comparable algorithms, while still being able to converge to the global optimum in certain conditions. And empirically, you can see our standard graphs where we're below everyone else. We're green. So empirically, we can find much better minima, both for structure promotion and protein folding, and we're excited about applying this to other domains as well. So, and the intuition I'll leave you with, if you're familiar with my advisor, Pedro, his work is on some product networks. And so you can think of this as like a continuous analog of constructing a sum product network like approximation to this continuous function, and then optimizing that, which is where this kind of efficiency comes from. So you can talk to me about that at my poster later. Thanks.